March 15, 1834, Magnolia Manor, South Carolina. The most brutal night in Charleston County's history began not with screams, but with the gentle scraping of a gardening spade against frozen earth. Eliza Thornfield, 17 years old, groundskeeper's daughter with dirt permanently embedded beneath her fingernails, would transform from tender of roses to architect of graves before dawn broke across the blood-soaked gardens she had cultivated her entire life. By sunrise, 3 members of the Whitmore family would be buried beneath the very rose bushes they had forced her to plant, their bodies becoming the fertilizer for blooms that would grow more beautiful than ever before. Do you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows? Subscribe and comment your location to join the investigation. March had arrived at Magnolia Manor with unseasonable frost, coating the sprawling gardens in a crystalline shroud that made every footstep echo like breaking bones. Eliza Thornfield, bastard daughter of the estate's head groundskeeper, moved through these frozen pathways with the calculated precision of someone who had learned that survival depended on invisibility. She was both creator and prisoner of this botanical paradise. Every rose bush, every hedge maze, every flowering vine had been shaped by her calloused hands, yet she could never truly possess the beauty she had cultivated. Tonight, she would reclaim ownership in the most permanent way possible. The Whitmore family, patriarch Samuel, his wife Constance, and their eldest son Edmund, slept peacefully in their warm beds, unaware that their trusted groundskeeper's daughter had finally discovered the truth about her mother's death, about the promises broken, about the violence masked as gentility. This is the true story of how a garden became a graveyard, how love transformed into vengeance, and how the most beautiful roses in all of South Carolina bloomed from the darkest soil imaginable. Tonight, we descend into the earth where secrets grow. The contrast between worlds existed in mere footsteps. 30 yards from the manor's gleaming windows, where whale oil lamps cast golden halos across silk wallpaper and imported crystal, the groundskeeper's quarters squatted like a festering wound against the landscape. Here, Eliza pressed her eye against a crack in the wooden shutters, watching the Whitmore family celebrate another evening of abundance while she shivered beneath threadbare wool. March's bitter wind howled through gaps in the cabin's walls, carrying with it the mingled scents of wood smoke from the manor's 8 fireplaces and the acrid stench of the slave quarters beyond the tobacco fields. The juxtaposition was deliberate, architectural, a geography of power that placed the groundskeeper's family in perpetual limbo between privilege and bondage, close enough to tend the beauty, but never to truly possess it. Inside the manor, warmth radiated from marble hearths taller than Eliza herself. The dining room blazed with the light of 40 candles, their wax imported from Boston at a cost that exceeded her father's yearly wages. Constance Whitmore's laughter tinkled like silver bells as she recounted tales from her latest Charleston shopping expedition, her words floating through leaded glass windows to reach Eliza's frost-numbed ears. But here, in this wooden box her father had built with his own hands, dampness seeped through every board. The single fireplace, more kindling than stone, struggled against the relentless cold, producing more smoke than heat. Eliza's breath emerged in visible puffs as she hunched over her mother's journal, the leather cover warped from years of humidity and neglect. The pages revealed truths that made the physical cold seem trivial. Her mother, beautiful Sarah Thornfield, had not died in childbed, as Eliza had been told for 17 years. The carefully preserved entries, written in Sarah's educated script, chronicled a different story entirely, one of promises made and broken, of a master's son who had wooed a groundskeeper's daughter with poetry and proposals, only to abandon her when pregnancy threatened his inheritance prospects. Outside, the rose garden stretched like a moonlit cemetery, each bush carefully positioned according to Eliza's design. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent her life creating beauty to mask ugliness, cultivating paradise above a foundation of lies. Tonight, she would reverse that equation, planting truth in the soil and letting beauty grow from the decomposition of deceit. Eliza's transformation had begun 3 days earlier, when she discovered the loose floorboard beneath her father's bed. The journal hidden there had cracked open her world like an eggshell, revealing the rotting core beneath 17 years of carefully constructed lies. Her mother's elegant handwriting spoke of love letters from Edmund Whitmore, of secret meetings in the rose garden, of promises to elevate her station through marriage. But most devastating was the final entry, dated just days before Sarah's supposed death in childbirth. Edmund came today with his father's ultimatum. I am to disappear, to take the child and vanish as if I never existed. When I refused, he struck me. The roses I planted for our future children will now bloom over my grave. The words had rewired something fundamental in Eliza's mind. Every interaction with the Whitmore family now carried a different weight. Edmund's casual dismissals, Constance's condescending smiles, Samuel's complete invisibility when he looked at her. All of it crystallized into a pattern of systematic erasure. They had murdered her mother and stolen her birthright, forcing her to tend the very garden where her mother lay buried. Sleep had become impossible. Food turned to ash in her mouth. The familiar rhythms of groundskeeping, pruning, weeding, watering, transformed into rehearsals for something darker. Her hands, already calloused from years of garden tools, now gripped the wooden handles differently, testing their weight, their balance, their potential for purposes beyond horticulture. The psychological shift was geological in its scope, where once she had moved through the world apologetically, shrinking from conflict. Now she walked with the measured deliberation of someone who had finally understood the rules of engagement. The Whitmores had taught her that violence could be genteel, that murder could wear the mask of respectability. Tonight, she would apply those lessons in the most literal way possible. Her mother's journal had become both scripture and strategy guide. Each evening, she read Sarah's accounts of Edmund's promises, his father's threats, his mother's complicit silence. The words carved themselves deeper into her consciousness until they achieved the weight of divine commandment. Justice had been denied for 17 years. Tonight, justice would bloom like roses fed on blood and bone, beautiful and terrible and absolutely inevitable. The garden tools arranged on her workbench caught moonlight like instruments of sacrament. Sarah Thornfield had been 19 when Edmund Whitmore first noticed her among the roses. The courtship, according to her journal entries, had possessed all the romance of a Gothic novel: clandestine meetings at midnight, love letters hidden beneath loose stones in the garden wall, whispered promises of a future where class distinctions would dissolve like morning mist. Edmund, then 22 and heir to the Whitmore fortune, had been studying law in Charleston but spent summers at the family estate. Sarah's beauty was legendary, even among the neighboring plantations: cascading auburn hair, intelligent green eyes, and hands that could coax life from the most stubborn soil. She was educated beyond her station, having been taught to read by the Manor's previous mistress, a kindness that would ultimately amplify her tragedy. The journal entries from 1816 read like poetry. Edmund composed verses comparing Sarah's eyes to emeralds, her skin to magnolia petals. He spoke of traveling to France together, of building a new life where Southern social hierarchies held no power. He gave her books, Shelley, Byron, Gothic novels that fed her romantic imagination and made his promises seem not only possible, but inevitable. But pregnancy changed everything. When Sarah informed Edmund that she carried his child, his poetry transformed into panic. The Whitmore family fortune was built on respectability, on careful marriages that preserved wealth and status. Samuel Whitmore had already arranged his son's engagement to a Charleston banking heiress. A bastard child by the groundskeeper's daughter threatened not just Edmund's inheritance, but the family's entire social position. The final confrontation had occurred in the rose garden itself. Sarah's journal described Edmund's face as he delivered his father's ultimatum: disappear with $50 and never return, or face the consequences. The groundskeeper's shed had always been Eliza's sanctuary, a wooden cathedral dedicated to the tools that shaped living beauty from raw earth. Tonight, it transformed into an armory, each implement assuming deadly significance under the pale light of a waning moon. She moved through the familiar space with ritualistic precision, her fingers trailing across metal surfaces worn smooth by decades of use. The pruning shears came first, her mother's favorite tool, according to the journal. Eliza had sharpened them just that morning, the curved blades gleaming like crescent moons. They were designed for delicate work, for separating healthy growth from disease, for cutting away what no longer served the garden's greater purpose. Tonight, they would perform that same function on a larger scale. The gardening spade occupied the place of honor, mounted on pegs her father had carved himself. Its wooden handle was stained dark with years of honest labor, the metal blade nicked from encounters with stubborn roots and hidden stones. This was the tool that had killed her mother, accidentally, according to Edmund's panicked confession in one of Sarah's final journal entries. Tonight, it would achieve more deliberate purpose. But the hand trowel held special significance. Small enough to conceal, sharp enough to penetrate, it was the tool Eliza used for her most intimate garden work, transplanting seedlings, coaxing new life from reluctant soil. Its blade bore the accumulated stains of 1,000 plantings, each dark spot a testament to its life-giving purpose. How fitting that it should transition from creator to destroyer, from midwife to executioner. She arranged the tools on the workbench like a surgeon preparing for operation. Each piece was cleaned, sharpened, blessed with the kind of attention she usually reserved for prize specimens. The whetstone sang against metal, sparks danced, in the darkness like fallen stars. The ritual of preparation calmed her racing heart, channeled her fury into something focused and surgical. The rope came last. Not garden twine, but thick hemp rope typically used for securing heavy plantings. She measured it carefully, testing knots her father had taught her for anchoring climbing roses. Tonight, these same knots would serve a different anchoring purpose, ensuring that the Whitmore family remained permanently planted in the soil they had claimed to own. Each tool was blessed with a kiss, anointed with tears that had been 17 years in the making. The shed door closed behind her with the finality of a coffin lid. Samuel Whitmore, patriarch and plantation owner, slept in the master bedroom's 4-poster bed, his 60-year-old body soft from decades of others' labor. His hands, which had never known honest work, rested peacefully on silk sheets worth more than most families earned in a year. Those same hands had signed the order for Sarah's burial, had counted out $50 blood-soaked dollars as the price of his son's reputation. Tonight, they would dig his own grave. In the adjoining bedroom, Constance Whitmore dreamed behind heavy velvet curtains, her 45-year-old face preserved by expensive creams and a lifetime of avoiding direct sunlight. She had known about Edmund's affair with Sarah. The journal made this clear through descriptions of Constance's knowing looks, her deliberate cruelties toward the groundskeeper's daughter. She had chosen complicity over compassion, silence over justice. Her throat, which had never spoken in Sarah's defense, would be the first to feel steel. Edmund himself occupied the third-floor suite, a space designed to showcase his status as heir apparent. At 39, he had grown comfortable with his crime, had transformed murder into mere inconvenience through years of willful forgetting. His law practice in Charleston thrived on his reputation for discretion, for handling the uncomfortable secrets of wealthy families. The irony was exquisite. He had become professionally skilled at burying truth, just as he had literally buried Sarah Thornfield. Each family member represented a different facet of systematic oppression. Samuel embodied patriarchal authority, the power to decree life and death based on social convenience. Constance represented complicit femininity, the woman who upheld oppressive systems in exchange for comfort and security. Edmund combined both, the entitled son who took what he wanted and discarded what became inconvenient. They also represented 17 years of Eliza's stolen childhood. Every birthday celebrated without a mother's kiss, every scraped knee comforted by her father's clumsy hands instead of gentle maternal care, every night spent wondering why she felt so alone in the world, all of it traced back to their collective decision that Sarah Thornfield's life was expendable. They had taught Eliza that some people's lives held more value than others, that violence was acceptable when dressed in respectability, that the powerful could rewrite history to serve their convenience. Tonight, she would apply these lessons with the thoroughness they deserved, ensuring that the Whitmore family's final chapter would be written not in legal documents or social registers, but in the rich, dark soil of their prize-winning garden. Constance died first, her final breath emerging as a barely audible whisper into the silk pillowcase that had muffled her attempts to scream. Eliza had entered through the servants' staircase, a passage she knew better than the family members who had built it, and moved with the practiced silence of someone who had learned to be invisible. The hand trowel slid between ribs with surprising ease, finding the heart with the same precision Eliza used to plant bulbs at exact depths. Blood, warm and thick as garden mulch, soaked into 1,000-count Egyptian cotton sheets. Constance's eyes, wide with shock and recognition, reflected the moonlight streaming through windows she would never see morning through. Her hands, soft from a lifetime of leisure, clutched futilely at the tool that had ended her, leaving crimson fingerprints on the wooden handle like some macabre signature. Samuel required more effort. Age had made him lighter, but terror had made him desperate. He managed a single cry before the pruning shears found their mark, the curved blades designed for woody stems proving equally effective on aged throat cartilage. The sound he made, a wet, gurgling protest, reminded Eliza of the fountain in the main garden, water struggling through clogged mechanisms. His blood splattered the silk wallpaper imported from France, abstract patterns that told the story of 17 years of overdue justice. Edmund fought hardest, his legal training perhaps providing him with a clearer understanding of what his family had earned. He threw himself from the bed, scrambled across polished hardwood floors, reached the door before the garden spade caught him between the shoulder blades. The irony was perfect. The same tool that had accidentally killed his mother now deliberately claimed his life, coming full circle like the seasons Eliza had watched change from her servants' quarters. His final words were not pleas for mercy or expressions of remorse, but legal threats, promises of constables and hangmen, reminders of his social standing. Even dying, he could not comprehend that the rules protecting him had finally been suspended. The spade rose and fell with agricultural rhythm, each blow accompanied by Eliza's whispered recitation of her mother's journal entries, turning murder into liturgy. When silence finally settled over Magnolia Manor, 3 bodies lay cooling in their own blood, and Eliza Thornfield, groundskeeper's daughter, bastard child, forgotten victim, stood transformed into something her mother's killers had never imagined possible, an agent of absolute, blooming justice. The hardest part was not the killing. Death, Eliza discovered, came easier than she had expected. The hardest part was the digging, the methodical excavation of 17 years of carefully maintained garden beds to create space for the family that had stolen her mother's resting place. Each shovelful of earth felt like archaeology in reverse, burying the past rather than uncovering it. Her shoulders burned with an exquisite ache as the garden spade bit into soil she knew more intimately than her own reflection, earth that held the memory of every seed she had planted, every root she had transplanted, every grave she had unknowingly tended. The first strike of metal against earth produced a sound like breaking bones, a wet crack that seemed to echo through the midnight silence with prophetic finality. The soil, black and rich from decades of careful cultivation, clung to the spade's blade like reluctant flesh being peeled from bone. Each excavation released the accumulated fragrances of decomposition and growth. The sweet rot of last autumn's fallen leaves, the metallic tang of earthworms and beetles, the underlying musk of her mother's remains slowly surrendering their essence to nourish the beauty above. She began with Samuel in the prize rose garden, the very spot where his son had struck down Sarah Thornfield. The irony was so perfect, it felt like divine orchestration. The patriarch's body, wrapped in his own silk bedsheets like some grotesque chrysalis, disappeared into soil that had been enriched by her mother's decomposition for nearly 2 decades. The Egyptian cotton, worth more than most families earned in a season, darkened with earth and blood as she rolled his corpse into the waiting grave. His face, slack in death, bore an expression of perpetual surprise, as if he had finally encountered something his wealth could not purchase or his authority could not calm. Manned, the roses above would drink deeply of Whitmore blood, their roots threading through his ribs like parasitic vines, their blooms achieving unprecedented richness and color from the dissolution of his privileged flesh. Constance found her eternal home beneath the herb garden, where rosemary and thyme would season her decay with aromatic irony. The hole Eliza carved for the matriarch was shallower, but wider, accommodating the woman's soft form that had never known the discipline of honest labor. Her body, still warm with residual life, settled into the earth with a wet sigh that seemed to merge with the night wind moving through the garden's corridors. Her soft hands, which had never known honest labor, now gripped handfuls of earth that would transform her jewelry-adorned fingers into fertilizer for cooking herbs. The emerald rings and pearl bracelets that had once announced her status would become mineral nutrients, feeding basil and sage. The woman who had seasoned her words with cruelty would now season the manor's meals with her own dissolution, her essence absorbed into plants that would flavor the food of whoever next claimed this cursed paradise. Edmund received the most elaborate burial, deep beneath the maze of hedge roses that had once provided cover for his courtship of Sarah. His grave required the most effort, carved 6 feet into soil that grew increasingly dense and clay-heavy with depth. Eliza arranged his body carefully, positioning his hands as if reaching for something forever out of grasp. Perhaps the love he had discarded, perhaps the mercy he had never shown. Perhaps the justice that had finally caught him in sleep's vulnerable embrace. The legal documents in his coat pocket, deeds, contracts, promises written on paper that time would reduce to pulp, would provide nutrients for root systems that cared nothing for property law or inheritance rights. His law books, thrown into the grave as afterthoughts, would decompose into knowledge that served only earthworms and the patient roots of climbing roses. Dawn was breaking as Eliza replaced the final shovelful of soil, her movements automatic and reverent as a priest performing communion. The eastern sky blushed pink and gold, colors that seemed to mirror the blood-enriched earth beneath her feet. She smoothed each disturbed bed until no trace of excavation remained visible, using techniques her father had taught her during 17 years of apprenticeship in the art of making the disturbed appear undisturbed. 3 days of normalcy followed the killings, 3 days during which Eliza performed her groundskeeping duties with the same quiet efficiency that had made her invisible to the Whitmore family for 17 years. The routine became her sanctuary, each familiar task now imbued with deeper meaning. She watered the rose bushes that now served as headstones, the morning dew mixing with irrigation in patterns that seemed almost ceremonial. The water, drawn from the same well that had served the manor for generations, now carried nutrients directly to her mother's killers, completing a cycle of justice that felt as natural as the seasons themselves. She pruned the hedge maze that concealed Edmund's eternal rest, each clip of the shears a small benediction over his grave. The maze had once been his playground, his private sanctuary for conducting illicit affairs and making promises he never intended to keep. Now it was his mausoleum, its living walls growing thicker and more impenetrable with each passing day. The herb garden required the most delicate attention. She harvested rosemary and thyme from soil enriched by Constance's decomposing flesh, the aromatic herbs carrying an intensity she had never achieved before. The irony of tending her victims' graves while mourners still searched for their bodies struck her as deeply appropriate. She was both cemetery groundskeeper and chief mourner, the only person who truly knew where the Whitmores rested, and the only one who felt genuine satisfaction at their passing. Her hands, stained with soil that contained their essence, performed these duties with reverent precision. She was caring for them better in death than they had ever cared for anyone in life. The Charleston constables arrived on the 4th day, their horses' hoofbeats announcing their approach like a funeral dirge. They had been summoned by concerned business associates who had expected Samuel at a cotton auction. creditors who found empty offices where they expected to collect debts, and social acquaintances who discovered invitations unanswered and appointments unmet. The constables, three men whose understanding of investigation extended little beyond asking obvious questions and drawing obvious conclusions, found the manor exactly as the family had left it. Beds slept in, but not made, the sheets still bearing the impressions of bodies that would never again seek rest between Egyptian cotton and down-filled pillows. Breakfast preparations begun, but never completed, eggs still sitting in their basket, bread still rising in the kitchen that would never again know the sounds of morning activity. A chess game abandoned mid-move in the parlor, Samuel's strategic position frozen forever in time, his king perpetually threatened by Edmund's advancing knight. Every detail suggested sudden departure rather than violent death, as if the Whitmores had simply evaporated like morning dew, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their existence. Their personal effects remained undisturbed. Jewelry in its cases, money in the safe, traveling trunks stored in the cellar rather than loaded in carriages. The scene spoke of interrupted routine rather than planned escape, mystery rather than violence. Constable Harrison, a heavy-set man whose uniform strained against his considerable bulk like sausage casing, questioned Eliza with the patronizing tone reserved for servants and children. His voice carried the assumption that she was slightly simple, that her position as groundskeeper's daughter automatically limited her capacity for observation or deception. Had she seen anything unusual? Did the family mention travel plans? Were there any strangers on the property? His questions revealed more about his assumptions than his investigative skills. It never occurred to him that the groundskeeper's daughter might be anything more than a witness to events beyond her understanding, that she might possess intelligence sharp enough to orchestrate the very mystery he was failing to solve. Eliza's performance was masterful, honed by years of practiced invisibility and refined by 3 days of rehearsal. She wrung her hands appropriately, the gesture so naturally servile that Harrison relaxed visibly in her presence. She expressed concern for her employer's welfare, with precisely the right degree of worry, enough to seem caring, not enough to seem suspicious. She volunteered to help search the grounds for clues, her eagerness interpreted as simple-minded devotion rather than strategic misdirection. Justice, Eliza learned through months of watching and waiting, was a luxury reserved exclusively for those whose victims possessed sufficient social standing to warrant the attention of men who measured tragedy in terms of lost tax revenue and disrupted commercial relationships. No grand jury convened to investigate the Whitmore disappearance, despite their prominence in Charleston's mercantile circles. No reward was posted for information leading to their discovery, though Samuel's cotton investments alone were worth more than most plantations. No heartbroken relatives demanded answers from authorities who were far more interested in maintaining the delicate social order that preserved their own positions than in uncovering uncomfortable truths that might implicate respected families in unsavory affairs. The families simply faded from Charleston's collective memory like expensive ink dissolving in rainwater, their absence creating barely a ripple in the social fabric they had helped weave through decades of careful cultivation of influence and respectability. The legal system that would have ruthlessly pursued any crime against the Whitmores with the full weight of Southern justice showed remarkable and telling disinterest in their mysterious absence. Edmund's prestigious law practice was quietly dissolved by his surviving partners within a fortnight of his disappearance, the men dividing his wealthy clients and lucrative case files among themselves with the cold efficiency of well-dressed scavengers methodically stripping a fresh carcass of anything valuable. Samuel's extensive business interests, cotton warehouses, shipping contracts, slave trading partnerships, were absorbed by competitors who had been circling like patient vultures for years, waiting for just such an opportunity to expand their own empires at the expense of a rival's misfortune. Even their supposedly devoted social circle adapted with surprising and almost insulting speed, filling the conversational vacuum left by their disappearance with fresh gossip about other families' scandals, newer intrigues, more current sources of entertainment that didn't require the uncomfortable effort of genuine concern or investigation. The bitter irony was not lost on Eliza as she observed this systematic erasure of people who had once commanded such fear and respect. The same social invisibility that had protected the Whitmores' brutal crime against her innocent mother now served as an impenetrable shield protecting her own methodical crime against them. Justice had finally come, but not through the grand courtrooms and legal proceedings that Edmund had once navigated with such arrogant confidence. Instead, it had arrived through the kind of natural correction that occurred when apex predators were permanently removed from a delicate ecosystem, allowing the environment to heal and flourish without their destructive presence poisoning every interaction. The garden was demonstrably healthier without them, the roses achieving colors and fragrances that surpassed anything in her mother's detailed horticultural records. The very air seemed cleaner now that their poisonous presence had been transformed into something useful, their essence absorbed into fertile soil that could finally nurture beauty instead of supporting cruelty. She continued her groundskeeping duties under the distant supervision of the estate's executor, a nervous cousin from Savannah, who visited exactly twice yearly to ensure the property maintained its monetary value for potential sale. He barely acknowledged her existence during these brief inspections, seeing only the garden's unprecedented and almost supernatural beauty, the prize-winning roses that had achieved legendary status throughout Charleston County and beyond. Garden clubs from across the South now sent formal requests for cuttings from the famous Magnolia Manor collection, their letters filled with flowery praise and generous offers. These distinguished botanists unknowingly spread Edmund, Samuel, and Constance Whitmore's transformed essence throughout the entire region, their remains nurturing beauty in gardens from Virginia to Georgia. The executor's detailed reports to potential buyers focused exclusively on the property's remarkable horticultural achievements, describing blooms of unprecedented size and depth of color that defied scientific explanation. Visiting botanists theorized endlessly about unique soil composition and revolutionary secret fertilizers, never suspecting that the secret ingredient was justice itself, 17 long years in the making. Eliza aged gracefully into her 20s, still tending her victims' unmarked graves, still maintaining their living memorial garden, still serving as the sole witness to their true fate. She had evolved into something unprecedented. A jury, executioner, and gravedigger combined into one person. A complete judicial system, condensed into a single individual who had finally achieved the long-overdue balance the courts had failed to provide. The trial that never came had been replaced by something far more permanent and infinitely more satisfying. 20 years later, Eliza Thornfield had transformed into something that existed in the liminal space between faithful servant and whispered legend, the mysterious groundskeeper whose calloused hands could coax impossible, almost supernatural beauty from the unforgiving red clay of Carolina soil. Her reputation had spread far beyond the boundaries of Charleston County, carried by travelers and botanists who spoke of her achievements in the hushed, reverent tones typically reserved for discussing miracles or witnessing the divine made manifest in earthly form. Visitors to what had gradually become known throughout the region as the Whitmore Memorial Garden, though curiously, no one could quite remember exactly which members of the Whitmore family were being memorialized, or what specific tragedy had befallen them to warrant such elaborate horticultural commemoration, spoke in awed whispers about the enigmatic woman who moved through the immaculate rose beds like some earthbound spirit, communing with her plants in ways that seemed to transcend ordinary botanical understanding and venture into realms that science could not adequately explain or replicate. The roses themselves had achieved an almost mythical status throughout the horticultural circles of the antebellum South, becoming the gold standard against which all other cultivated blooms were measured and inevitably found wanting. Precious cuttings from the legendary Magnolia Manor collection commanded extraordinary prices at Charleston's most elite garden shows and exclusive botanical exhibitions, creating waiting lists that stretched for years and included some of the wealthiest plantation owners and most distinguished gardening enthusiasts from Virginia to Louisiana. Prestigious botanical societies published lengthy, detailed papers attempting to explain the unprecedented vigor, remarkable longevity, and almost supernatural beauty of these particular plants. their learned authors theorizing endlessly about unique soil conditions, revolutionary secret fertilizers, innovative irrigation techniques, and groundbreaking pruning methods that might account for such extraordinary results. None of these distinguished scientists suspected that the true secret ingredient was decomposing justice itself, that each magnificent bloom drew its haunting perfection from the slowly transformed flesh of those who had once trampled beauty beneath the heavy boots of their inherited privilege and casual cruelty. Eliza had grown into her role so completely over the passing decades that she had become something more elemental than human, evolving into less of a person than a force of nature, an integral part of the garden's ecosystem that could no more be separated from the soil than the roots could be separated from their roses. She spoke rarely during her interactions with visitors, and when she did break her customary silence, her words carried the weight of someone who had learned profound secrets about the relationship between death and beauty, between justice and cultivation. She moved through her domain with the fluid, almost supernatural grace of someone who had spent years learning to be completely one with the earth she tended so devotedly, her footsteps silent on pathways she could navigate blindfolded, her hands instinctively knowing exactly where each plant required attention. Visitors invariably found her presence simultaneously comforting and deeply unsettling. She was clearly devoted to her work, with an intensity that bordered on the spiritual, yet she carried some indefinable psychological weight that made casual conversation feel inappropriate and extended lingering inadvisable. The story of the mysteriously vanished Whitmore family had evolved and transformed through countless retellings over the years, becoming progressively more mysterious, romantic, and dramatic with each iteration as it passed from mouth to mouth throughout Charleston's social circles. Some storytellers claimed with absolute certainty that the family had fled under cover of darkness to Europe to escape crushing gambling debts and avoid social disgrace. Others whispered more scandalously about midnight duels fought over matters of honor, illicit affairs that had finally been discovered, or business dealings that had crossed dangerous lines with dangerous people. A few of the more superstitious locals suggested supernatural intervention, that the family had somehow been claimed by some ancient curse or malevolent spirit connected to the land they had owned for generations but never truly understood or respected. Only Eliza knew the complete truth, and she guarded it as carefully and protectively as she guarded her garden's other profound secrets, treating the knowledge as both burden and blessing. Sarah Thornfield's leather-bound journal remained safely hidden beneath the loose floorboards of the groundskeeper's cottage, its yellowed pages serving simultaneously as irrefutable evidence of past crimes and sacred scripture for a justice that had finally achieved perfect balance through perfect concealment. The roses bloomed each spring with increasingly supernatural beauty, their deep roots drinking greedily from soil that had been enriched by 20 years of slow, patient decomposition and transformation. Visitors often commented on the garden's almost overwhelming fragrance, the way the intoxicating scent seemed to carry whispers of stories too beautiful and terrible to ever be spoken aloud in polite company. They invariably left feeling both spiritually uplifted and mysteriously haunted, carrying with them the unnamed but absolute certainty that they had witnessed something that transcended ordinary horticulture and touched the realm of the sacred. Eliza Thornfield died on a crystalline spring morning in 1854, her lifeless body discovered peacefully nestled among the prize-winning roses that had simultaneously served as both her life's devoted work and her beloved mother's unmarked monument for nearly 4 decades of silent dedication. She was precisely 37 years old at the time of her passing, the exact same age her innocent mother Sarah would have reached when the Whitmores brutally stole her future and buried her dreams beneath the very soil that now cradled her daughter's final rest. The familiar gardening spade that had violently ended 3 privileged lives 2 decades earlier lay beside her still form, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of honest labor, finally returned to its original, intended purpose as a humble tool of cultivation and growth, rather than an instrument of calculated vengeance and long overdue retribution. Her hands, permanently stained with the rich earth she had tended so lovingly, still clutched a handful of rose petals, as if she had been blessing her charges one final time before surrendering to the eternal sleep that would unite her at last with the mother she had spent her entire existence mourning and avenging. The estate's new owners, a prosperous young family from Charleston's merchant district who had purchased the legendary property specifically for its world-renowned gardens and the social prestige such ownership would confer, discovered a carefully sealed letter hidden within Eliza's sparse personal effects in the groundskeeper's cottage. The parchment bore her mother's wax seal, pressed with the simple wildflower design that Sarah had used in her correspondence decades earlier. The contents of this final confession proved too scandalous for any possibility of public consumption, too meticulously detailed and corroborated to be dismissed as mere fantasy or the ravings of a disturbed mind. In Eliza's precise, educated handwriting, so remarkably similar to her mother's elegant script, they read of premeditated murder disguised as justice, of 3 bodies methodically buried beneath the estate's prize-winning roses, of 17 patient years spent nurturing revenge until it bloomed as beautifully and inevitably as the flowers that concealed her victims' remains. The letter detailed every aspect of her methodical plan, from her discovery of her mother's journal to the exact locations of each grave, from her psychological transformation into an instrument of vengeance to her decades of tending the living monuments she had created over her enemies' bones. Rather than immediately alerting the proper authorities to investigate graves that were now more than 20 years old and long since transformed into integral parts of the garden's ecosystem, rather than destroying the garden's legendary reputation and obliterating their own substantial financial investment in the property, the new owners made a carefully calculated and morally complex choice that would haunt their consciences for years to come. The damning letter was ceremoniously burned in the cottage's fireplace on a moonless night, its incriminating ashes deliberately scattered among the roses where its subjects rested in their unmarked graves. Some knowledge, they reasoned with the cold pragmatism of successful merchants, was simply too dangerous for the civilized world to possess, too perfectly resolved in its terrible symmetry to be disturbed by the clumsy machinery of belated legal justice that could only destroy without creating anything beautiful or meaningful in return. The magnificent garden continued to flourish under their new management, though it never again achieved quite the supernatural, almost otherworldly beauty it had displayed during the decades under Eliza's devoted and spiritually connected care. The roses remained undeniably extraordinary by any reasonable standard, their blooms still carrying hints of their former transcendent glory. But something indefinable yet essential had been irretrievably lost with their creator's death, as if her spirit had been the crucial element that transformed mere horticulture into something approaching the divine. Visitors still came in steady streams from across the South and beyond, still marveled at the garden's undeniable beauty, still departed with the lingering sense that they had witnessed something that transcended ordinary cultivation and touched the realm of the sacred and mysterious. Local folklore gradually absorbed the truth over the passing years, transforming documented fact into romantic legend, cold justice into haunting ghost story that parents told children on dark winter nights. People throughout Charleston County spoke in whispers of the devoted groundskeeper's daughter, who had tended roses that bloomed with impossible beauty, who had loved the cursed land so completely and passionately that her protective spirit remained bound to it even in death. Brave children dared each other to visit the garden at the stroke of midnight, claiming with wide-eyed certainty that they could glimpse Eliza's translucent shadow moving silently among the flower beds, still pruning with ghostly shears, still planting seeds that would never grow, still ensuring through supernatural vigilance that beauty continued to grow from the rich soil of long overdue retribution. The roses bloomed eternal in their terrible beauty, their deep roots permanently intertwined with the slowly dissolving bones of those who had learned far too late that every garden requires fertilizer, that every earthly paradise grows inevitably from the patient decomposition of what came before. In death, the Whitmore family had finally achieved their only truly worthy purpose. They had become the foundation for something genuinely beautiful, permanent, and absolutely just. The memory of those rare souls who dared to fight for justice, even when that justice required becoming the very darkness they opposed, blooms forever in secret gardens where supernatural beauty masks the bones of the wicked.